Part 7. 1. The Levins had been more than 2 months in Moscow. The date on which, according to the most exact calculations of a person experienced in such matters, Kitty should have been confined, had long passed. But she had not yet been delivered, nor were there any signs that the time was nearer now than it had been 2 months previously. The doctor, the midwife, Dolly, her mother, and especially Levin, who could not think without horror of what was coming, began to experience impatience and anxiety. Kitty alone was perfectly calm and happy. She now distinctly realized the awakening of a new sense of tenderness for the coming, and for her to some extent already existing child, and she yielded with pleasure to that feeling. It was no longer entirely part of herself, but now and then lived its own independent life. Sometimes this occasioned her pain, but at the same time she wanted to laugh because of this strange new joy. All whom she loved were with her, and all were so kind to her and so attentive, and everything was presented to her in so pleasant an aspect, that had she not known it must soon come to an end, she could not have desired a better or pleasanter life. The only thing that marred the charm of this life was that her husband was not as she loved him best, not as he used to be in the country. She loved his quiet, kindly, and hospitable manner on his estate. In town he always seemed restless and on his guard, as if afraid lest someone should insult him, or, worse still, her. There, on his estate, feeling that he was in his right place, he was never in a hurry to go anywhere, and was always occupied. Here in town he was always in a hurry, as if fearing to miss something, and yet he had nothing to do. She was sorry for him. She knew that to others he did not appear to need pity. On the contrary, when Kitty watched him in company, as one sometimes watches a person one loves, trying to see him from a stranger's point of view, so as to realize the impression he makes on others, she saw, even with some jealous fear, that far from needing pity, he was very attractive, by his good breeding, his rather old-fashioned and timid politeness to women, his powerful figure, and, as she thought, his uncommonly expressive face. But she understood him not from without, but from within, and saw that in town he was not himself. She could not otherwise define his condition. Sometimes in her heart she reproached him for not knowing how to live in town. At other times she confessed that it was really hard for him to arrange his life here satisfactorily. Indeed, what could he do? He did not care for cards, he did not go to the club. She knew now what consorting with gay people of Oblonsky's sort meant. It meant drinking, and then driving somewhere. She could not think without horror of where men drove to in such cases. Go into society? But she knew that to do so he would have to find pleasure in being with young women, and she could not wish that. Stay at home with her and her mother and sisters. But, agreeable and amusing as the same oft-repeated conversations might be to her, talks about Alines and Nadines, as the old prince called those talks between the sisters, she knew they must bore him. Then what was left for him to do? Continue to write his book? He did try to do it, and began by going to a public library to take notes and look up references he required. But, as he explained to her, the less he did, the less time he seemed to have. And he also complained that he had talked too much about his book here, so that all his ideas had become confused and he had lost interest in them. The one advantage of this town life was that here they never quarrelled. Whether it was that the conditions of town life were different, or that they both had grown more careful and reasonable in this respect. At any rate, in Moscow they never had quarrels resulting from jealousy, such as they had feared when they moved to town. An event even occurred of great importance to them both in this respect, namely Kitty's meeting with Vronsky. The old princess, Mary Borisovna, Kitty's godmother, who had always been very fond of her, particularly wished to see her. Though Kitty was not going out anywhere because of her condition, yet she went with her father to see the venerable old lady, and there met Vronsky. The only thing Kitty could reproach herself with, when that visit was over, was that for an instant, on recognizing Vronsky's once so familiar figure in his civilian clothes, she grew breathless. The blood rushed to her heart, and she felt a deep flush suffusing her face. But this lasted only a few seconds. Her father, purposely addressing Vronsky in a loud voice, had not finished what he was saying before she was quite ready to face Vronsky, and if need be, to converse with him, just as she conversed with the Princess Mary Borisovna. Especially so that everything down to the lightest intonation and smile might be approved by her husband, whose unseen presence she seemed to feel above her at that moment. She exchanged a few words with Vronsky, and even smiled at a joke he made about the elections, to which he alluded as our parliament. She had to smile to show that she understood the joke, but she at once turned to the Princess Mary Borisovna, and did not once look round at Vronsky till he rose to go. Then she looked at him, but evidently only because it is impolite not to look at a man when he's bowing to you. She was grateful to her father for not saying anything to her about this encounter with Vronsky, but, by his peculiar tenderness to her during their daily walk after the visit, she saw that he was pleased with her. She was pleased with herself. She had not at all expected to find strength to shut down somewhere, deep in her heart, all memories of her former feelings for this man, and not merely to appear, but really to be quite tranquil and calm in his presence. Levin blushed much more than she had done when she told him she had met Vronsky at the Princess Mary Borisovna's. It was very difficult for her to tell him this, and still more difficult to go on giving him details of the meeting, as he did not ask anything, but only frowned and looked at her. "I'm very sorry you were not there," she said. "I don't mean present in the room. I should not have behaved so naturally with you there. I am now blushing much more, much, much more," she added, blushing to tears, "but I'm sorry you could not look in through a crack." Her truthful eyes told Levin that she was satisfied with herself, and in spite of her blushes, he grew calm at once, and began questioning her, which was just what she wanted. When he had heard all, down to the fact that just for the first second she could not help blushing, but that afterwards she had felt as natural and easy as with anyone she might happen to meet, he became quite happy, and said he was very glad it had happened, and in future he would not behave as stupidly as he had done at the election, but would try to be as friendly as possible with Vronsky next time he met him. "It is so painful to think that there is a man who is almost my enemy, whom I dislike to meet," said Levin. "I am very, very glad." 2. "Well then, please call on the balls," said Kitty to her husband when, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, he came to her room before going out. "I know you're dining at the club. Papa put your name down. But what are you going to do this morning?" "Only going to see Katavazov," answered Levin. "Why so early?" "He promised to introduce me to Metrov. I want to have a talk with him about my work. He's a celebrated Petersburg scholar," replied Levin. "Ah, yes. It was his article you praised so. Well, and then?" inquired Kitty. "Then I may call round at the courts about my sister's case." "And the concert?" "Oh, what's the good of my going alone?" "Ah, yes, do go. They're giving those new pieces. It used to interest you so. I should certainly go." "Well, in any case, I'll come back for dinner," he said, glancing at his watch. "But put on a morning coat, so that you can call on the Countess ball on the way." "Is it absolutely necessary, then?" "Yes, absolutely. He called on us. Why, where's the difficulty? You'll call on your way, you'll sit down, talk about the weather for 5 minutes, and then get up and go away." "Well, will you believe it? I've got so out of the habit that it makes me feel ashamed. A stranger arrives, sits down, remains a while doing nothing, disturbs them, upsets himself, and goes away again." Kitty laughed. "But as a bachelor you used to pay calls," she said. "I did, but I always felt ashamed, and now I am so out of the habit of it that, seriously, I would rather go without dinner for 2 days than pay that call. It is so embarrassing. I feel the whole time that they will be offended and will say, 'Why have you come when you have no business here?' No, they won't be offended. I will vouch for that," said Kitty, looking laughingly into his face. She took his hand. "Well, goodbye. Please call on them." He was about to go after kissing her hand when she stopped him. "Kostya, do you know I have only 50 rubles left?" Well, what of that? I'll call at the bank and get some. How much? He asked, with a dissatisfied look familiar to her. No, wait a moment. She held him by the hand. Let's talk it over. It bothers me. I don't think I spend on anything superfluous, and yet the money simply flies away. There's something we don't do right. Not at all, he said, coughing and looking at her from under his brows. She knew that cough. With him it was a sign of great displeasure, not with her, but with himself. He was really dissatisfied, not because they had spent so much, but because he had been reminded of a matter which, well knowing that something was wrong, he wished to forget. I've told Sokolov to sell the wheat and draw the money for the mill in advance. We shall have money in any case. Yes, but I'm afraid that in general too much— Not at all, he repeated. Well, goodbye, darling. But really, sometimes I am sorry I listened to Mamma. How nice it would have been in the country. As it is, I've worn you all out, and we are wasting money. Not at all. Not once since our marriage have I said to myself that things might have been better than they are. Is that true? She said, looking into his eyes. He had said it without thinking, to comfort her. But when he looked and saw those dear, truthful eyes questioningly fixed on him, he repeated the words from the bottom of his heart. Decidedly, I'm forgetting her, he thought, remembering what was so soon awaiting them. Will it be soon? How do you feel? He whispered, taking both her hands in his. I've so often thought so, that now I've given up thinking. And you are not afraid? She smiled contemptuously. Not an atom, she answered. Well, should there be anything, I shall be at Katavazov's. No, there won't be anything. Don't imagine it. I shall go for a walk on the boulevard with Papa. We will call at Dolly's. I'll expect you before dinner. Ah, yes. Do you know, Dolly's situation is becoming quite impossible. She's deep in debt and has no money. Mom and I were talking about it with Arseny. So she called her sisters, the Princess Lvova's husband, and we decided to set you and him at Stiva. It is quite impossible. We can't speak to Papa about it. But if you and he— But what can we do? Said Levin. Well, anyhow, you will see Arseny. Have a talk with him, and he will tell you what we decided. I'm ready to agree with Arseny beforehand. Well, I'll call on him then. By the way, if I go to the concert, I'll go with Natalie. Well, goodbye. At the porch, Kuzma, an old servant of his bachelor days, who was now managing the household in town, stopped Levin. Krasavchik, one of the pair of carriage horses brought from the country, has been reshod, but still goes lame, said he. What are your orders? On first coming to Moscow, Levin had taken an interest in the horses they brought from the country. He wanted to arrange the matter as well and as cheaply as possible. But it turned out that their own horses cost them more than hired ones would have done, and they hired horses as well. Send for the vat. Maybe it's a bruise. Yes. And what will Catherine Alexandrovna do? Asked Kuzma. Levin no longer thought it strange, as he had done when he first came to Moscow, that to go from the Vozdivchenka street to Zivtsev-Frashchak, it was necessary to harness a pair of strong horses to a heavy carriage to drive through the snowy slush a quarter of a verst, to keep the carriage waiting there for 4 hours, and to pay 5 rubles for it. Now all this seemed quite natural. Hire a pair of horses to be harnessed to our carriage. Yes, sir. And, thanks to the conditions of town life, having thus simply and easily solved a difficulty which in the country would have required much exertion and personal attention, Levin went out, called in his vozchik, and drove to the Nikitskaya. On his way, he thought no more about money, but considered how he could make the acquaintance of the Petersburg scholar, who was studying sociology, and how he would talk to him about his book. Only during the very first days in Moscow had the unproductive but inevitable expenditure, so strange to country folk, yet demanded on all sides, startled Levin. Now he was used to it. In this respect, the thing had happened to him which is said to happen to drunkards. The first glass you drive in like a stake, the second flies like a crake, and after the third, they fly like wee little birds. When he had changed the first 100-ruble note to buy liveries for the footman and hall porter, he had involuntarily calculated that those useless liveries, which, however, were absolutely necessary, judging by the surprise of the old princess and Kitty at his hint that one could do without liveries, would cost as much as the hire of 2 labourers for the summer months, that is, of one for about 300 working days between Easter and Advent, and each a day of heavy labour from early morning till late in the evening. He parted with a 100-ruble note, not without a struggle. The next such note he changed to buy provisions for a family dinner, costing 28 rubles. And though he remembered that 28 rubles was the price of 9 chatfords of oats mown, bound into sheaves, thrashed, winnowed, sifted, and shovelled with sweat and groans, nevertheless it went more easily than the first. The notes he now changed no longer evoked such calculations, but flew away like wee birds. Whether the pleasure afforded by what it purchased corresponded to the labour expended in acquiring the money was a consideration long since lost sight of. His farming calculations that there is a price below which certain grains must not be sold were forgotten too. The rye, after he had so long held out for a certain price, was sold 50 kopecks a chatford, cheaper than he had been offered him a month ago. Even the calculation that it would be impossible to live for a year at that rate of expenditure without running into debt, even that calculation had lost its meaning. The one thing needful was to have money in the bank, without asking whence it came, so as to be always sure of the wherewithal to get tomorrow's beef. Till now he had always observed that rule. He had always had money in the bank. But now he had no money remaining there, and did not quite know where to get any. It was this that had upset him for a moment when Kitty reminded him about money. However, he had no time to think about it. While driving, he thought of Katavasov and of making Metrov's acquaintance. 3. During his stay in Moscow, Levin had renewed his intimacy with his fellow student of university days, now Professor Katavasov, whom he had not seen since his marriage. He liked Katavasov because of his clear and simple outlook on life. Levin thought Katavasov's clear outlook resulted from the poverty of his nature, and Katavasov thought Levin's inconsequential opinions resulted from a lack of mental discipline. But Katavasov's clarity pleased Levin, and the abundance of Levin's undisciplined thoughts pleased Katavasov, so they liked to meet and argue. Levin had read some parts of his book to Katavasov, who liked it. Happening to meet Levin at a public lecture the previous day, Katavasov had told him that the celebrated Metrov, whose article had so pleased Levin, was in Moscow and was much interested in what Katavasov had told him of Levin's work, that he would be at his house next day about 11 in the morning and would be very pleased to make Levin's acquaintance. "Decidedly you are improving. Quite a pleasure to see it," said Katavasov as he welcomed Levin in the little drawing-room. "I heard the bell and thought, it's impossible he can have come punctually." "Well, what do you think of the Montenegrins? They are born warriors." "What's happened?" asked Levin. Katavasov in a few words told him the latest news, and, taking him into the study, introduced Levin to a tall, sturdy, and very agreeable-looking man. It was Metrov. The conversation rested for a time on politics and on how the highest circles in Petersburg regarded the latest events. Metrov quoted words on the subject attributed to the emperor and one of the ministers, which he had from a reliable source. Katavasov, however, had heard with equal definiteness that the emperor said something quite different. Levin tried to imagine a situation in which both utterances might have been made, and the subject was dropped. "He has written almost a book on the natural condition of the labourer in relation to the land," said Katavasov. "I am not a specialist, but as a naturalist, I liked his not taking humanity as something outside zoological laws, but on the contrary, regarding it as dependent on its surroundings, and searching in this dependence for the laws of its development. "That is very interesting," said Metrov. "I really began to write a book on agriculture, but being occupied with the chief instrument in agriculture, the labourer," said Levin with a blush, "I involuntarily arrived at quite unexpected results." And Levin began carefully, as if feeling his way, to expound his views. He knew that Metrov had written an article running counter to the generally accepted teachings of political economy, but how far he could hope for a sympathy with his own novel views, Levin did not know. I could not gather from the expression of the professor's quiet and intelligent face. "But in what do you perceive the peculiar quality of the Russian worker?" asked Metrov. "In his zoological qualities, so to say, or in the conditions in which he is placed?" Levin detected in this very question a thought with which he did not agree. But he continued to expound his view, which was that the Russian labourer's view of the land is quite different from that of other nations. To illustrate this theory, he hastened to add that, in his opinion, the Russian people view results from their consciousness of a vocation to populate the vast, unoccupied tracts in the East. "It is easy to be led astray when drawing conclusions as to the general vocations of a people," said Metrov, interrupting Levin. "The condition of the labourer will always depend on his relation to land and capital." And without letting Levin finish explaining his idea, Metrov began expounding to him the peculiarity of his own teaching. What that peculiarity consisted in, Levin did not understand, because he didn't even try to do so. He saw that Metrov, like the others, despite the article in which he refused the teachings of the economists, still regarded the position of the Russian labourer merely from the standpoint of capital, wages, and rent. Though he had to admit that in the eastern and greater part of Russia, rents were still nil, that wages, for 9/10 of the 80 millions of the Russian population, represented only sustenance for themselves, and that capital did not yet exist except in the form of most primitive tools. Yet he regarded every labourer merely from that one point of view, though on many points he disagreed with the economists and had his own theory of wages, which he explained to Levin. Levin listened reluctantly, and at first made objections. He wanted to interrupt Metrov and to state his own idea, which he considered would render a further statement of Metrov's view superfluous. But afterwards, having convinced himself that they looked at the question so differently that they would never understand one another, he ceased making objections and merely listened. Though what Metrov was saying now no longer interested him at all, he felt some pleasure all the same in hearing him. His vanity was flattered by the fact that so learned a man should explain his opinions to him so willingly, so carefully, and with such faith in Levin's knowledge of the subject, that he sometimes by a mere hint indicated a whole aspect of the matter. Levin attributed this to his own worth, not knowing that Metrov, who had exhausted the matter with all his intimates, was particularly pleased to speak about it to any fresh person, and, in general, willingly spoke to everybody about the subject with which he was occupied, and which was not yet clear to himself. "I'm afraid we shall be late," said Katavazov, glancing at the clock as soon as Metrov had finished his disquisition. "Yes, there is a meeting of the Society of Amateurs in honor of Vintage Jubilee," Katavazov went on, in answer to Levin's inquiry. "Peter Ivanovitch, Metrov, and I have arranged to go. I have promised to read a paper on his work on zoology. Come with us, it will be very interesting." "Yes, it is quite time," remarked Metrov. "Come with us, and then, if you care to, come home with me. I should very much like to hear your work." "Oh no, it is still so unfinished, but I shall be pleased to go to the meeting." "And have you heard? I gave in a separate report," Katavazov called out from the next room, where he was changing his coat. They began a conversation about a controversy in the university, which was one of the most important events in Moscow that winter. The 3 old professors on the council had not accepted the opinion of the younger ones. The younger ones presented a separate resolution. This resolution was, in the opinion of some people, a dreadful one, while according to others it was very simple and just. The professors were divided into 2 camps. The side to which Katavazov belonged accused their opponents of mean treachery and deception, while the others imputed youthfulness and disrespect for authority. Levin, though he did not belong to the university, had since his arrival in Moscow more than once heard and conversed about this affair, and had formed his own opinion on the subject. And he took part in the conversation, which was continued in the street, until they all three arrived at the old university buildings. The meeting had already begun. At the table covered with a cloth at which Katavasov and Metrov took their seats, 6 men were sitting, and one of them, with his head bent close over a manuscript, was reading something. Levin took one of the vacant chairs which were standing round the table, and in a whisper asked a student who was sitting there what was being read. With a displeased look at Levin, the student replied, "The biography." Though the biography of the scientist did not interest Levin, he listened involuntarily, and learned a few interesting facts about this celebrated man's life. When the reader had finished, the chairman thanked him and read aloud some verses for the jubilee sent by the poet Ment, adding a few words of thanks to the poet. The Katavasov, in his loud, strident voice, read his paper on the scientific work of the man whose jubilee it was. When Katavasov had finished, Levin looked at his watch, saw that it was getting on for 2, and thought that there would be no time to read his manuscript to Metrov before the concert, and besides, he no longer felt inclined to do so. During the readings, he had also been thinking about the talk they had had. It was now clear to him that though Metrov's views might perhaps be of importance, his own ideas were of importance too, and these views could be formulated and led to results only if each of them worked separately along the lines he had selected. But communicating them to one another could not lead to any result. Making up his mind to decline Metrov's invitation, therefore, Levin approached him as soon as the meeting ended. Metrov introduced him to the chairman, with whom he was discussing the political news. In this connection, Metrov told the chairman the same thing that he had already told Levin, and Levin made the same remarks as he had made in the morning, but for the sake of diversity, expressed also a new view of his own, which had but just entered his head. After that, they began talking about the university question. As Levin had already heard all that, he hastened to tell Metrov that he regretted he was unable to accept his invitation, shook hands, and drove off to the Lvovs'.